Hello there, my name's Susan and I'm one of the occupational therapists in Highland Council working with children and young people. I'm also a member of the Pines Neurodevelopmental training team. The next area that we're going to look at together is sensory. We're going to consider this alongside the other areas in our 6-piece wheel. Remember that these areas don't sit in isolation and that there can be an overlap between them. We're going to refer also to your wheel grid tool and those 3 P's. Presentation, what is it that we're seeing? Profile, why might that be happening? And plan, how can I support the child or young person that I know or that I work with? So, what senses do we know? Let's take a moment to really think about this. When I do this in the training room, it's usually a bit of an interactive task, so we'll give it a go in this format too. If I asked you to very carefully to stand up and to stand on one leg for a count to 10, think about what your body's doing. And then, if I asked you to do the same, standing on one leg for a count of 10 with your eyes closed, and compared the difference between the first position and the second position, what answers might you come up with? Let's pause the film and think about that for a minute. Okay, great. We're going to store that for a few slides further down to have a think about. But in the meantime, we're going to have a think about something else. I want you to have a think about a sensation that you love. Why do you love that sensation? What's so good about it? And have a think about one that you hate. Yeah, it's not for you at all. Okay, we're going to pause the film again and have another little think. Okay, so what was the thing that you loved? Maybe it was taking a lovely bubble bath at the end of a busy and hectic day. Maybe it was going out for a run. What about the things that you hated? Perhaps it might be the feel of a new fabric or, a new jacket. Well, it's not you. Or it could be the smell of a scented candle. I like going out for a walk in the snow. That's one of my favourite things. I love it. I love the fresh, crisp atmosphere and the crunch under my feet. The thing I don't like about that so much is when my fingers and my toes get a bit cold and I get that tingly feeling when the blood's kind of coming back into them again. We're all sensory beings, and how well we respond to messages received from our senses can fluctuate day to day and throughout the day. So sometimes if we have a greater understanding of ourselves and our responses to sensory input, it can help us when we're working with our children and young people, whether at home or in the classroom. Thanks for giving it a go. You were great. From birth, our senses are used to gather, to sort, and to learn about our world, and that leads to our perception of our environment. All the time, we're gathering information about our environment through our sensory channels. Now, we know that for some of our children with neurodevelopmental differences, they have, to a greater or lesser extent, altered sensory perceptions and experiences. I know that you'll be familiar with the traditional 5 senses, thinking about hearing and sight, taste, smell and touch. And what we're going to do is just take a couple of minutes to have a look at them in a little bit more detail. Let's start with hearing. Hearing is an area of possible sensitivity. Crowded places or echoing environments can be challenging. Persistent low-level noise, kind of thinking about perhaps computers or a strip light, a buzzing strip light, or the projector that maybe links up with the smart screen in the classroom. All of those can be challenging, and sometimes those sounds can be heard as loud as a voice, as someone talking to you, and you might be exposed to that noise in the morning, but you might have carryover, and the impact of that will be seen later in the day or perhaps in the evening when you're at home. If we consider sight, that's sort of those visual elements, perception and experience again may be different. For some children, fluorescent lights or colours could be a challenge. Some children may have a strong visual system, so they might be taking in lots of information, which can be really useful, but can also be a bit overwhelming when you're trying to figure out what's the key piece of information that I need to know. What is it that I need to be able to participate in the activity or the task that you're asking me to do? I need to figure that out so that I can sort through it and process it to be able to complete that task satisfactorily. If we think about taste, we know that taste can contribute to selective eating for a variety of reasons, including textures, whether they might be crunchy or sloppy, but also that could be in relation to smells. And we know that smell and taste are two systems that work closely together. It can also be impacted by past experience, whether that be positive or negative. So that past experience of a particular food, and for some children, it's the very look of food, including colour, that can have the impact. If we were to consider smell, whether that be perfume or smoke or coffee, in school, whether it's a dinner hall or a science lab or a changing room, all of those things can be challenging for some children and young people. Taste and smell, as I've said, work together, and some children prefer cold food. Part of this may be challenges with smell and temperature. Finally, if we have a look at touch, whether that be the feel of clothes or labels or holding hands, sitting close to somebody else, all of those things can be challenging. Some children might respond to a slight brush as you pass by them, as if they've been hit. Children might not be getting enough feedback from touch, and this can lead them unintentionally to pushing a peer too hard, or sitting too close to you, or on top of other children, perhaps in circle time or when you're sitting on the sofa at home. They may give you a bear hug instead of a gentle cuddle. So those are those 5 traditional senses. You'll see also on our slide 3 other sensory systems that we recognise, but they are less well known. And the one at the top there is called our proprioception system, and that looks at feedback from our muscles and joints. Let's take a couple of minutes to have a little think about that. So, say I were to ask you, with your eyes closed, to either fasten your shoelaces or perhaps write your name. How come you would know what your hands were doing, even though you couldn't see them? Well, it's because of that feedback from our muscles and joints, which contributes to the proprioceptive system. So there are a few examples of proprioception working well. If we think about perhaps touch typing, a skill that lots of us can kind of do. We're much more exposed to keyboards these days than ever we were. So at school, we've maybe got a Chromebook. At home, we'll have, laptops or tablets or one of these kind of smartphones. But we're able to operate them because we might be able to do that kind of very clever kind of smarty pants thumb texty thing, or me, old lady texting with the old finger. But we can all do that because we know how much pressure we require to put on the keys to be able to produce the information that we want on the screen. Say perhaps you've got something stuck in one of your teeth, after your dinner, and you're waggling at it with your tongue to try and get it dislodged. It's hugely satisfying when it comes away. But again, it's your proprioceptive system that's feeding that activity while you're doing it. Another example of a self-care task that's hugely dependent on proprioception is, bottom wiping. So you go to the toilet, if you're able to wipe your bottom effectively, that is because of an effective proprioceptive system that's working well. If your proprioception system isn't working so well, it can be demonstrated in a number of ways. So if we think back to our keyboard example again, could be merrily bashing away on it because you're just not sure how much pressure to use. Another one, if we're thinking about our handwriting, you might often see this one in the classroom, or at home if you're doing homework with your children. You can see just a really tense and pressured hand. We're just not sure how much pressure to put on this pencil to make it work, to do that writing. And subsequently, when you come to rub out a mistake, that can be a bit harder because you've put so much pressure, it's been so dark, and it's really hard to rub out. It's just a bit tricky. It could well be, that whole thing about in circle time, sitting too closely to others because you just can't tell how far away they are or your position in space in relation to others. You just can't figure that out so well. Some other examples of proprioceptive rich activities could be, standing in line, sitting still, knowing when you've been sitting too long, when your bottom's just getting a bit sore, if you're sitting on a classroom chair for, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, jingle jangle. It could be being part of a group, whether you're playing basketball or, you're maybe having to do a partnered activity for gymnastics. It could be, crafting or construction, if you're crafting and you've got to kind of blob out some glue, how hard you have to squeeze that bottle to get the glue out on the page. Or if you're, say, building with Lego or some other kind of construction material, how much push and pull do you have to exert to be able to manipulate the pieces effectively? Holding and using cutlery is another really good example that requires really good proprioceptive feedback. Finally, if we're thinking perhaps about our older kids, those young people, those kind of teenage years, applying makeup, styling your hair, being able to wear the latest fashion, those kind of things are so important for teenage appearance. But again, they rely heavily on that proprioceptive feedback and an effective proprioceptive sensory system. Okay, the next one round that we've got there is our vestibular system. Engaging brain and thinking back a few slides to that activity when I asked you I'm doing it here, when I asked you to stand on one leg. And then I asked you to stand on one leg with your eyes closed. That is very much influenced by your vestibular system, your balance system, those little mechanisms inside our ears that subtly adjust and accommodate for our balance requirements day to day. Balance is a part of the vestibular system. And remember that standing on one leg is also, from what we've just been talking about, really reliant on that effective proprioceptive feedback, that feedback from our muscles and joints. But there's also an element of requirement for your balance system. And I think that's a really nice illustration of the interaction between those senses. So they rely and they're interdependent on each other. There's that kind of interlinking between those two systems effectively to be able to undertake that task. As well as keeping us balanced, the vestibular system has a role in our level of alertness too. So, for example, something you'll all recognise, if you've got a small child or a baby who's a bit unsettled or tired, we would probably pick them up, coorie them in and kind of maybe rock to soothe them and maybe to settle them off to sleep, she said, demonstrating beautifully. So that has an impact on our level of alertness. It calms it down, it winds it into a soothing and comforting part. But if I were to, and I'm not going to, but if I were to stand here and do some star jumps, that would absolutely up my level of alertness. So that vestibular system can calm us and it can alert us. It's a really smart system. Usually, we hardly notice the balance system working, because for most of us, it happens without conscious thought. In children, the balance system is activated through things like, being on the swings or the roundabouts, or actually physically just spinning themselves around. When the balance system's working well, we can see it when we're able to do activities like cycling or climbing or, being on a skateboard or a scooter. And the balance system works really closely with the visual system as well. And I think that's really demonstrated when you look at someone like a ballet dancer, and they spend years perfecting their technique of being able to sort of spin without becoming dizzy. You know, they learn that kind of technique where they spot and they're able to, you know, perform beautifully complex moves, and they can do it and still smile. We have to recognise, though, that there can be a mismatch between our balance system, so our vestibular system, and our visual system, and that sometimes can be uncomfortable. And if we explore sensations when there is a mismatch in balance and visual systems, it really can help us just to appreciate how uncomfortable that can be. I'm guessing that for a large number of you, you've probably sat on a train, and it's that feeling when you're in the station or you're, you know, stationary and another train comes past, and there's a split second when you don't know if it's your train that's moving or the one out there. Your eyes are telling you that something's happening, something's moving, but your body is telling you a different message, and there's a bit of a conflict in there, and you're just trying to fathom it out. And sometimes it's a split second, and sometimes it is is that them or is that us? But you figure it out and you go with it. But it's that discomfort and confusion and that sort of not quite fathoming it out and understanding it that can be present within all of these sensory systems for some of our children. That discomfort and confusion, if someone's sensory system's not working well, then they may frequently experience that sort of sensation and challenge through their day. And I think we can all appreciate just, you know, that's just maybe not a nice state to be in. Okay, on our chart, we've got one more sense to explore here together, and that's interoception. Interoception is that kind of internal mechanism that tells us when we're hungry, when we're thirsty, when perhaps we're too hot or too cold, when we're nervous or excited. You know, you get that kind of washing machine sensation in your tummy. Interoception also tells us, you know, when we need to go to the toilet, or when we feel that urge and we're going to be sick. It's a hugely important sense. We're learning more about it all the time, but I think we can appreciate why for some of our children, if we don't have an effective interoception system, then their ability to interact and participate in all those everyday activities can be a little bit harder. Hopefully, through this little chat, through this slide, we can see that the 8 systems don't work in isolation. Each overlaps and integrates with the others. Each sense has a very specific role, and our sensory system is impacted by the other areas in our neurodevelopmental differences wheel, so those other areas that the other speakers are talking about with you. And I'm recognising particularly that the things that Claire spoke about, you know, the motor and the sensory systems are closely linked, and sensory difficulties can also be part of another condition. Sometimes the messages from our senses to our brain can get a bit scrambled. Okay, so let's think about pulling some of this together at this point. We know that all human experience has a sensory element. For some people, their sensory system develops really well, so it all feels smooth and automatic. For others, it's not so smooth or automatic, and a sensation that for some people is very minimal, such as maybe something brushing past them, can feel painful. For others, they may experience something and it goes by unnoticed. It's not registered by them. We recognise sensory processing, which we all do. We recognise sensory differences, which we all have. And we recognise sensory difficulties, and those are the occasions when we might need help from others. Sensory differences can be problematic if the child or young person is uncomfortable, if the child or young person is not able to carry out an activity they would like to do, or an activity that's important sort of developmentally. That could be like, for example, toileting. Or if the child or young person, if their sensory difference is preventing them from doing an activity, or it could be raising a bit of a safety problem for them, then we need to have a think about it. So these next two slides are going to give some examples of the different kinds of behaviours you might see if there's a sensory processing difficulty. So we could have a strong or exaggerated response, that could be a startle to a loud noise, whether that's the school bell or a door banging. They could be sitting too close or on top of another person. Now we've mentioned this, the encircle time on the sofa, lining up in the canteen or to come out of school. There could be that difficulty in filtering out background noises, so they might struggle to follow a verbal instruction, or perhaps find trips to the supermarket could be hard work. They might be fidgeters, they need to be fiddling with something, whether it's their hands, whether it's a concentrator, or whether it's their whole body that's involved, whether they're rocking or swinging in their chair. So here, chewing on things, dislike of textures and foods, they might seek out things to chew, whether that be a food or a non-food item. There might be challenges starting and ending an activity and that whole thing about managing transitions, and that will have been noted by everyone that you've been listening to during this presentation. That whole thing about struggling with the tolerating of the feel of things, it might be a dislike or an irritation by the feel of your clothing. We've mentioned, there might be that over or under reaction to pain. And this last one here, that masking of discomfort, where you might not see it, it's that whole notion of it, being similar to an iceberg. What is it that you can see above the water? What's the behaviour that you see? And actually, what's happening underneath? There's a whole wealth of other stuff that's going on under there that you can't quite see at this moment in time. So again, these are just different things to be aware of and to consider. Okay, let's have a little think about different levels of sensitivity. It is normal for our sensory system to fluctuate. If the sensory system is having difficulties regulating, then there can be larger fluctuations. At times, we can experience too much of a sense, and it can be oversensitive. Or we can experience too little and can be unaware of sensations as they're happening to us. At times, our sensory system can be hyper or high, which is great if you're about to play a game of tennis, but can be really rubbish if you're trying to get off to sleep. Or our sensory system can be hypo or low, which is great for going to sleep, but not much help at all if you're standing across the net from Andy Murray. For lots of us, but not for everyone, learning between high and low is good. For some children, they can get to that just right level for learning and activities. Other children can find this difficult. Sometimes that can be because of communication problems or perhaps a learning difficulty. Sometimes we can offer whole class activities that can be helpful. And it's those kind of activities that use that proprioceptive system that we spoke about, using those muscles and joints. These activities are generally helpful for children who are too high because it can bring them down a little, and those that are too low because it can bring them up a little, so that they both kind of sit at that just right level. And it's helpful for everyone. As we process that sensory information, sometimes we can take a long time to register it, so we can be hypo. Or sometimes a sense can be processed really, really quickly, and it can overwhelm us in seconds. Sometimes we can take a greater amount of a sense to fill my cup. So I need lots of opportunity with that sense for my cup to be full and at that just right level. Sometimes I might just need a smaller amount, so my cup fills much more quickly when I'm exposed to that sense. So I don't need as much as I might do on another occasion. So I might need a lot of a movement activity and a movement opportunity, but very little of, say, an activity that impacts on my hearing. We all process at different speeds, and some days we can cope, and other times it's just too much. If we're thinking about why this might be happening, it's important to consider that a reaction that we see might have a different basis than a sensory issue. We always need to be considering those other areas in our neurodevelopmental differences wheel. Remember also that if an experience perhaps is unexpected or uncontrolled, or there's a lack of understanding about it, then the ability to cope with the sensory experiences associated with that opportunity can be challenging too. If we're thinking about how we can support, then one technique that can be really helpful is considering different areas in your home or school from a sensory perspective. It might be the bedroom, it might be the living room, it might be your classroom or the area outside your classroom, but having a walk around when it's quiet and seeing what you're experiencing, having a think also about when that space is busy, and the contrast between the two can be a really useful technique to try. Having a look and thinking about all the different stimulus, is that absolutely essential that that's there? All the visual information, does that need to be there, or can we take some of it away? And those other pointers that we've got here around really getting the child involved in that transition between what an environment looks like and what changes are being put in place can be helpful too. The one at the bottom there, by way of offering regular movement breaks, physios and OTs love those, and when in doubt, a movement break can be good for all of us. Sometimes we think about movement breaks, but we can also introduce a break in sound. So sometimes having 1 minute's worth of activity, or 1 minute where there's no noise at all, can work really nicely too. The next couple of slides I'm going to let you have a look at your leisure. You can take as long or as quickly as you want to skim over them. But I want you to consider home and classroom from a sensory environment, bearing in mind that's how we gather information about our world. Thinking about the space, the smell, the textures, the lights, the sounds. So if you take a few minutes to do that, and I'll catch you on the other side. Okay, if we're thinking about how we can support, sometimes it can be as simple as offering a quiet area. It could be at home or in school. It could be within the family living room, or it could be their bedroom, or a quiet little chill out zone that you've got somewhere. And equally, it could be within the classroom or in a little anteroom. Considering what it is that the child or young person is struggling with a little bit, and how we can diminish that, and if there are any other factors that are at play as well, so that we're considering it in its biggest and broadest sense. Considering the use of visuals is easier as well, because they can be taken up or down to support the situation that you may be experiencing as well. Visuals can also help with understanding and making changes or challenges slightly more predictable for your child or young person too. Giving control and choices where appropriate and where it's easy to do can also work really, really well. It's that light bulb moment again. On reflection, is there anything you've noted through this sensory section? Do you recognise anything you see in the child or young person that you know or that you work with? Is there something that you've heard that you can try? Remember to consider the 6-piece wheel and how that can help you to capture your thinking. Just jot anything down, think about it, make a plan, and consider those next steps. Finally, here are some links for additional information, some other ideas that you might want to have a little look at. The occupational therapy team in Highland have a range of resources and practical solutions to share, as well as the Everyday Challenges film, which is on the Pines website. The Pines site also has a selection of films. Check out The Frazzled Fred, and it's available as a film and a download, and that explores the impact of sensory issues in much more detail. Kids Scotland have a lovely 7-minute video on an introduction to the senses from a child's perspective, as well as a range of sensory questionnaires and resources. They're really worth checking out. And finally there, we've got our Just Ask inquiry line on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the afternoon if you've got any queries or questions and want to speak to an occupational therapist or a member of the team. Thanks for listening.